Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of Sunday Sermons on Retrovolve.com. Good afternoon. My name is Andy Ryerson, the host of this show and founder of Retrovolve.com. Today's sermon is going to discuss the video game crash of 1983, more specifically the North American video game crash of 1983. The effects of this crash weren't really felt as much in other areas of the world as it was here in North America. And my goal with this discussion is kind of to set the record straight on a few things. There's been a lot that has been said and told about the video game crash of 1983. Of course, there are the urban legends and myths that were recently proven to be fact with the excavation of the landfill in New Mexico, uncovering tons of old Atari games. Specifically, E.T. is the big one that people kind of associate with that and with the video game crash in general. But I think it's fairly obvious once you start looking into it a little more. It's not really the fault of E.T. or Pac-Man for Atari 2600, which is another one people really like to bring up when discussing why the video game industry sort of fell into decline, in the early 1980s. But that was only let me put it this way. E.T. and Pac-Man they were kind of poster child for why people lost interest in home console video games in the early 80s. So let's just start kind of with a little bit of background information about the crash for those of you that maybe don't know much about it. I mean, I'm sure if you're into retro gaming, you've heard it referenced at different points, but I'll just provide a little bit of a history before we kind of discuss why the crash happened and, what eventually led to the video game crash of 83 sort of being overcome by the industry and what helped cause that. So, of course, in the 1970s was the first big arcade boom. It started, of course, with Pong, computer space, arguably, but really Pong was the first real mainstream hit in terms of arcade games. You'd put that thing into a bar or something, and there are legends of it would break because the quarter slot was jammed full and couldn't take anymore. So that it was proven that people did like this form of interactive entertainment and that there was an opportunity to make money there. So obviously tons and tons of companies wanted in on this, and eventually that led to not really the arcades disappearing, but companies sought to take that experience and transfer it into the home because I just think it's more practical to have a machine that plays games and allows people to experience this sort of thing at home as opposed to being at an actual arcade having to go out. And I think the home console market provides a greater return on investment than, say, the arcade did, because you go to the arcade, you pay your money. It's a small sum of money, but it's not something you pay your quarters or $1.50 or whatever it is now, and you get to play that game once, and that's it. So the home console was sort of a natural progression of video games, of something people could do at home. They could have this as the centerpiece of gatherings and parties. So, of course, Atari wasn't the first company to dive into home console manufacturing. There was the Magnavox Odyssey, Fairchild Channel F. I'm not too familiar with those systems, so I'm not going to pretend to know a lot about them, but Atari is really the first important one. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that. With the video computer system, later known as the 2600, it's also a fact not a lot of people are aware of. It wasn't originally called the 2600, but that's what everybody refers to it as these days. That's what I refer to it as, so it's not a purist thing. It's just kind of a fun little fact, but anyways, the Atari 2600 made its way into homes and was enormously popular. It launched at around $200, I think, and came with a copy of Combat and 2 joysticks, which to this day you sit down and pop in Combat with a friend and add in a couple beers. It's still really fun. Combat is one of the first memories I have of the 2600. Obviously, I was too young to be born, too young to have experienced. Born too young to have experienced the Atari when it was a modern system, but I did play Combat as a kid at my grandparents, who still had an old 2600 laying around from, my dad and his sisters when they were younger, and I just fell in love with the thing. But I'm not going to get too much into my history with this, because this sermon is surrounding a period which I didn't experience, which does make it a little hard to discuss, being that, I don't have any firsthand experience. But I think the research I've done and the people I've talked to throughout the years have really given me a decent knowledge on the subject. Anyways, excuse me. Swig of Cherry Coke Zero for the working man. So anyways, back to the discussion at hand. So the Atari 2600, or the VCS as it was known at the time, was enormously successful. It sold millions every single Christmas. People liked this thing, and for good reason. It had a lot of really, really quality titles. A lot that people weren't playing in arcades, given a lot of them were the rip-offs of things that were in the arcade. But I think people began to realize, how fun these home consoles could be, even though the hardware wasn't as advanced as it was in the arcades. The graphics weren't nearly as good, but people still really liked this. They liked the convenience of playing a game at home. But naturally, they had this desire to play the games that they did play on the arcade at home, which led to many, pretty much every single arcade game at the time you can imagine, being ported over to the Atari 2600 in some fashion, which of course led to, things like the Pac-Man cartridge happening. And I guess now would be a good time to sort of discuss that. We are going to leap ahead in the conversation a little bit. I know I'm kind of deviating from my plan that I proposed at the beginning of the sermon, but I'm not a professional. I'm just a guy with a microphone, so, give me a break. Anyways, so Pac-Man came to the Atari 2600 in the early 80s because, of course, Pac-Man fever. Everybody loved Pac-Man, and, of course, that led to everybody wanting to play Pac-Man at home, sitting at home on Tuesday night after work. You want to play Pac-Man. You don't want to go out to the arcade and play Pac-Man. You want to play it at home. So, of course, Atari saw money in this. They said, if we produce Pac-Man for the Atari 2600, it's just going to sell so many copies, we'll be rolling in money. So they basically gave the designer, and I want to say this was a Howard Scott Warshaw title. I'm actually going to check that real quick. Todd Fry. Excuse me. Not Howard Scott Warshaw was E.T. Excuse me. So credit where credit's due. Todd Fry was given the task of making a Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man in a really, really small amount of time. And, of course, given that small amount of time and the limited capabilities of the hardware, it kind of forced his hand into making a subpar product. And I actually am one of those people, and you'd be surprised at how many of us there are, but I am one of those people that I actually like Pac-Man for the Atari 2600. It's not the same experience, but I still think it's a fun game. It's another one of those, like I'd mentioned with Combat, that I played when I was younger, and maybe that does have something to do with it. But anyways, that's sort of the story surrounding Pac-Man for the 2600. We'll get back to that in a minute. When we kind of start discussing the beginning of the crash and sort of the decline of the gaming industry at the time. So we're going to jump forward a few years from the launch of the Atari 2600. We're into the early 80s now. Atari is hugely successful. Everybody loves the 2600. Gotta have it. Kids love it. Adults love it. It's the new thing to have. So naturally, as capitalism goes, one company makes money, one idea works, others look to mirror that success with a similar and perhaps better product, to take what somebody else did, improve it, and make even more money off of. And you saw tons and tons of other video game systems out there at the time. I mean, of course, the big ones, the legit ones, the Mattel Intellivision, fantastic system. Actually, I'm going to pick up my Intellivision Flashback tomorrow, which I'm really excited about. And of course, the ColecoVision was another one at the time, another great console. But you also had other really subpar systems, like the Bally Astrocade. I think Emerson made one. I think they make like refrigerators, and they were making home consoles. It was ridiculous. So these companies that didn't really understand gaming, and that's another thing too at the time, is just the video game industry didn't really know what it was yet. I don't think these companies even realized it was an industry. It was just this newer division of the of toys. It was in that same realm. It was a toy. And so that's I'm going to get back to that in a little bit, actually. But I'll just kind of plant that seed for now. So anyways, you had all these companies making consoles, and of course, a lot more companies wanting to make games for these consoles, because if there's consoles out there, you need games for those systems, and people are going to buy games for those systems. So after a while, the market just began getting flooded by all sorts of games from all these different developers. And it wasn't like it is now, where we can go on the internet, go to Metacritic, and find out within seconds if something's good or not. You didn't really have that back then. Even trade magazines were pretty rare in the beginning of the industry, and it really made it tough on consumers to know what was good and what wasn't. Of course, after a while, some brands like Activision, once they split off from Atari, or employees of Atari left Atari and made Activision, I should say. People did see that they made quality products. So if you saw, that the rainbow, the labels on games, and saw the Activision logo, you knew you usually were going to get a good game. But that was really about it. And what it led to is it just a lot of companies just throwing out games, thinking they could just throw a cartridge in a box with any old piece of shit game on it, and people would buy it. And unfortunately, some people did, and that was what really led to people kind of being disenchanted with video games. They, go to the store, say you're a kid, you saved up your allowance, and you want to buy a new game for your 2600, and you end up taking home some absolute piece of crap just because the box looked kind of cool, but you end up getting home and you couldn't even play this thing. You couldn't figure it out. Or like the E.T. game, for instance. You're a kid back in the 80s, you loved the E.T. movie, and if there's a video game of E.T., you're going to buy it. And it's not so much that E.T. was a horrible game. There certainly were much worse, but it was just a hard game to figure out. Even with reading the manual, I don't think me as a kid could have had any sort of freaking clue what you were supposed to do. So people, like I said, people just became disenchanted with video games in general, because just the market was oversaturated, and that's just going to be the natural result of oversaturating a market with bullshit, is people are going to lose interest and move on to something else. They're going to put the Ataris and the Intellivisions in the closet and gather dust. Just like you look back to last decade with the Wii. The Wii was so enormously successful at first, but after a few years, it got so flooded with shitty games just from companies wanting to make a quick buck off of these people that bought a Wii, that after a few years, nobody even had their Wii hooked up to the TV anymore. It was off in the closet somewhere. And those last few years of the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Wii generation, the Wii was a really forgotten console, unfortunately. But I guess that's a discussion for a different time. But just kind of creating a parallel with modern consoles, I think, is sort of helpful to the discussion here. So back to the Atari 2600, like I said, just so many games and no real way to differentiate what was good and what wasn't. And, parents would go out to maybe buy Christmas presents for their kids, and they'd see all these shitty games that would be marked down to $5, or Stampede or Enduro by Activision was $30-$40, and they're thinking to themselves, why would I pay this amount of money for this game when I can buy 6 games for the same price, all the while not knowing that these 6 games they were paying for instead were utter crap and their kids wouldn't play them. And it's not their fault. Like I said, there was no way of knowing what's good and what wasn't. And just the market for video games, like I said, the industry didn't know really what it was yet. And I think the consumers didn't really know what it was or what to expect from the industry yet. It was still really in its infancy, trying to figure out what it wanted to be. And I think that's kind of the cool thing about the generation, is there's so many wacky experimental parts of it, because, like I said, just the gaming industry didn't exist. It was just a subset of the toys and electronics industry. And I don't know, I think it made for some really cool, innovative ideas, but it also led to maybe threefold of that in utter shit, unfortunately. So we're getting to 1983 now, and like I've said before, the consumers are disenchanted with the product. They don't care. They've had their fun playing, their Space Invaders or Donkey Kong on their home consoles. Maybe an original title here and there. Demon Attack, of course, my favorite Atari 2600 game. One of the best games of all time, in my opinion. Anyways, just people got bored with it. The industry had grown stagnant, and just expanding on what I've kind of been saying throughout this thing is the video game industry didn't know what it was yet, and that started, I think, kind of from the top down, especially with Atari. You look at guys like Jack Tramiel, who I'm kind of fuzzy on the actual timeline of this, but I believe he bought Atari after the system had launched and kind of become successful, and didn't really have any sort of fucking clue what to do with it after he bought it. Thought he could run it like a toy company, and that just didn't work. And that's why you saw all of the programmers from Atari leave Activision, because they weren't being given credit for their games they created and given royalties even. I forget who it was. I want to say it was Rob Fulop, who made Demon Attack. I know that's a fact, but maybe he didn't say this, but in the Once Upon Atari film made by Howard Scott Warshaw, which I actually think you should all check out. It's really dated in terms of its production, but there's a lot of good information there. Once Upon Atari, go look it up. But one of the developers in that film, one of the people that worked for Atari, said Jack Tramiel, or maybe it wasn't Jack, I don't know, the details are vague, but one of the higher-ups at Atari told him that the programmers were just as important to the game as the people putting it in the box, which, I think we all can look at now and laugh at. That's complete bullshit. These are the creative people behind these games, making these games work, But the executives at, Mattel or Atari didn't really grasp this concept. I mean, given computers in general were a new thing, they didn't understand how programming worked. It wasn't, like assembling an erector set. There is a huge element of skill and creativity that goes into making a quality game. Even I would say, especially on older hardware such as the Atari 2600, where you had nothing to work with. So you were looking at a 4 kilobyte ROM cartridge to write an entire game to, and you had to be creative with the ways you use that 4 kilobytes to really maximize the hardware and maximize the space you were given. So I have a ton of respect for the people that made games for these systems. I just think it's so cool what some of these people were able to accomplish on that system. And, they weren't given the respect they deserved. They weren't given the credit they deserved. And, like I said, that led to good things like Activision. I know a lot of people these days are like, ooh, Activision's evil. But once upon a time, Activision really was the standard bearer for how to run a video game company and the standard bearer for quality and believe it or not, within the video game industry. There was a time when Activision just didn't pump out sequels of shitty shooter games and, licensed bullshit. That wasn't the case back in the 80s. But I apologize. I'm very, very good at getting sort of off subject and going on tangents. Like I said, I'm not professional. I'm just some dickhead with a microphone. So let's just get right to it. 1983 comes, and by now, the population has lost complete interest in video games in general. At least home console video games, I should say. I think I was doing just a little bit of reading just to kind of refresh my brain on some of this earlier, and I think I read somewhere that profits within the industry had decreased by something like 97%, which is just ridiculous to me that could ever even happen. For a whole industry just to collapse as it did is pretty incredible. But I think what a lot of people don't really realize is that while the home console business really floundered at the time, the computer gaming industry was actually, this is right when it started to take off, and you saw a lot of the early PC titles of the day really become popular. And so I think this period was kind of a good thing in a way. It allowed for the PC gaming sort of subset of the industry to kind of grow and flourish and kind of figure out what it wanted to be. And you look at home console games and PC games from around the same time in this early to mid 80s range, and they're two very different things in a lot of ways. You look at some of the RPGs that were produced in the 80s, the early 80s, they were all for the PC, whether it be, basic text adventures or the Ultima series or games like Rogue. You didn't get that on consoles. It wasn't until the late 80s where you really saw RPGs come to the home console market. So I think the home console crash kind of was a good thing in a lot of ways. And like I said, it really gave the video game industry time to sort of, take a deep breath and really just sort of figure out what it wanted to be, what it even was. And of course, that leads right into 1985, 1986, depending on what kind of the world or what area of the world you're referring to. But of course, Nintendo comes in and saves the day. Nintendo changes absolutely everything with the Famicom, as it's known in Japan, or of course the Nintendo Entertainment System here. And it's actually funny how they sold the retailers in this market, in the North American market, on carrying the Nintendo, because understandably retailers were extremely, extremely skeptical of even carrying anything video games at the time. You didn't see video games barely at all at retailers, and if you did, they were in some bargain bin in the back, marked for like $1 each. Nobody wanted anything to do with these. Any backstock they had, they were shipping back to wherever, get it as far away, dump it in a landfill, do whatever the hell you want with it, just don't have it in our store. So what Nintendo did, which, it seems silly now, but at the time was a brilliant move, they marketed the NES as a toy, and they did so by including that stupid looking robot, Rob, whatever you want to call it, with the system, and they marketed it as a toy. It wasn't a video game. I mean, it sort of played things that were like games, but it wasn't a game system. It was a toy. It came with a robot that its eyes light up and it moves around, and I don't actually know if its eyes light up. I've never actually played with one of those things because they were shit, but you have to give credit to it because, in my opinion, and this might be sort of a preposterous statement to make, but there is some element of truth to it, and that is that I think that the stupid ROB robot is just as important to the video game market reviving as Super Mario Brothers was. I mean, maybe Super Mario Brothers was the reason that sustained itself, but ROB robot, whatever the fuck it's called, got it in the door and got it on store shelves and let people see, holy crap, this is so much more advanced. The graphics are so much more colorful, and these games are so much better and bigger than the ones we had before. I mean, I don't remember the specific time, the first time I played Super Mario Brothers, but I remember just as a kid being completely entranced by it. And I wasn't born until 1987, so by the time I had played it, it'd been a few years since it had come out, and probably by then Super Mario 3 was out. But I just remember just being so just blown away by this game, and I could take this little mustache guy and run around, and I could climb up vines and stomp on monsters, and it was just the coolest thing ever. And it really, like I said, it just captured my imagination, and that's why I think video games, especially retro games, have stuck with me so long throughout the years. I mean, I still, every now and then, it's not as graphically impressive as it used to be, and I've seen everything and done everything you can ever possibly do in Super Mario Brothers, but it's still fun to play. And back then, people played this, maybe on a demo at a store and said, "Wow, this is so above and beyond anything we've experienced before." Sure, we loved our Atari 2600s; they were awesome, but this is new, this is exciting, and this is something I want to spend money on and put above my wood grain television set in my living room. And of course, the NES hit store shelves in North America in 1980. God, shit, what year? Maybe it was 84. As much as I read about retro video game hardware and games, I'm just really, really, really bad with dates and all that sort of thing, which is makes you sort of question, why is this guy running a retro gaming website? But nevertheless, I'm gonna look up this date because it'll drive me crazy. Okay, it was late 1985 then that it was launched in America. So 1985, late 85, probably didn't really garner widespread attention till 86. But yeah, so 1985, 1986 comes, the NES hits store shelves, makes money, video games are back, yay, Sega comes into the industry, Atari tries to come back and fails, sadly. But the point is, video games were back, and there really hasn't been a decline as drastic as there was from 83 to 85 ever since. I think Nintendo really established the gaming industry, not the gaming industry a subset of the toys and electronics industry. Gaming was its own separate entity. It was a major market influence with a extremely large demographic of consumers that wanted to buy these products and wanted to have them in their homes. So there you go. There you have it. There's this week's sermon about the video game crash of 1983. I don't know if you actually learned anything. Maybe this more just comes across as the ramblings of an extremely confused and delusional human being. Maybe that's the case. But I had fun talking about the crash and the things that caused it and what allowed it to recover, the video game industry that is, and thrive and flourish into what it is today. So that's it for this week. I am going to try to make this a weekly thing. Maybe it won't be every week. I'm really, really busy with my actual job. Surprise, writing about video games and making stupid retro gaming videos on the internet doesn't pay very well. So, but I am going to do one next week, and the topic of next week's will be what I feel is an extremely underappreciated and really unknown to a lot of people console, and that is the Atari 7800 Pro system. So if you have any questions or just any comments or anything you'd like to have heard on the show, I would be more than willing to read anything you have to say about the Atari 7800 or anything you have to say about today's episode. Please leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, you can leave them in the comment section of the video on Retrovolve, or you can email me, I suppose. I think I have you can email me at retrovolve@gmail.com. I don't think we have actual Retrovolve email addresses set up yet, But in the meantime, like I said, any comments or anything you'd like to share about your experience with the Atari 7800, please comment below or email me at retrovolve@gmail.com. So I hope to see all of you back in church, the Church of Fun, here at retrovolve.com next Sunday for discussion on the Atari 7800. Until then, stay classic.